Imagine a killer who leaves his motives, his coding messages, and like the literal bloody shirt of his victim right on the desk of the local newspaper.
Then just completely vanishes into thin air.
Right. Usually, when we examine a criminal investigation, there's this expectation of a clear path. We treat it like a puzzle. You find the edge pieces, you fill in the middle, and eventually the picture just kind of reveals itself.
That's the ideal scenario.
But when you look closely at the Zodiac Killer, you quickly realize someone dumped like 10 different puzzles into the exact same box. And then they threw away the lid, and half the pieces are just missing. It completely upends how we think about solving mysteries.
It really does. And it forces us to confront a pretty terrifying reality about investigations, which is that having an overwhelming amount of evidence, thousands of clues, fingerprints, eyewitness accounts, that does not automatically lead to the truth.
Yeah, not at all.
In fact, an abundance of data can actually create this impenetrable fog.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. If you are joining us right now, you are stepping into one of the most maddening, exhaustive webs of information in modern history. We've compiled a massive stack of sources for you today, from historical law enforcement archives to deep dive databases.
Oh, the databases are wild.
They really are. They compile every unhinged letter, every debated suspect, and every complex cipher related to the Zodiac. But our mission for you today isn't to simply recite a timeline of terrible events. We are going to extract the core insights about this unsolved mystery.
Right, getting to the actual mechanisms of it.
Exactly. We're going to examine the mechanics of those famous ciphers, analyze the prime suspects through the lens of modern confirmation bias, and ultimately try to answer the single most frustrating question of all. How on earth did this guy manipulate the system to get away?
That really is the ultimate question, because as the sources make abundantly clear, the Zodiac, he did not operate in the shadows. He practically demanded the spotlight.
He craved it.
He really did, and he weaponized the media to get it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you are looking to get well-informed quickly on the mechanics of this case, this is the ultimate masterclass in how a massive surplus of clues actually creates an unsolvable puzzle.
Oh, absolutely.
And to understand how he built that puzzle, we have to look at the bizarre, almost theatrical nature of his methods. For anyone familiar with the case, you know the killer's modus operandi was incredibly unstable. It's like a virus mutating to avoid a cure.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. First, the virus attacks couples in dark, secluded lovers' lanes.
Like Lake Herman Road.
Exactly. Then it mutates into this bizarre daylight costume attack at Lake Berryessa. And then, just 2 weeks later, it mutates again into an urban assassination of a cab driver in a wealthy San Francisco neighborhood. He constantly changes the rules of engagement.
What's fascinating here is the underlying psychological thread connecting these wildly different attacks, because the shifting geography and the methods, they weren't just tactical evasions, they were part of a larger performance.
A performance, yeah.
He wasn't simply a killer, he was a pathological self-promoter. He possessed this deep, compulsive need for an audience. He didn't just want to commit these crimes, he needed to be recognized as the author of them.
He practically treated his crimes like an ongoing marketing campaign. If we look at the Lake Berryessa attack, he approaches 2 college students, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard. They're just picnicking on a secluded island, but he doesn't just ambush them.
No, he makes an entrance.
Right. He emerges from behind a tree wearing a completely handmade black executioner's hood, and it drapes all the way down to his waist. And get this, he has clip-on sunglasses fastened over the eye holes.
Which is just such a surreal, unsettling detail.
It's terrifying. And he has a large white crosshair symbol drawn right onto the chest of this bib-like garment. He ties them up, attacks them, and then literally walks back to their car to write his score on the door with a felt tip pen.
Just writes it right on the metal.
Yeah, he lists the dates of his previous attacks right there. It's pure branding.
And the theatricality is the point. The costume wasn't to hide his identity from the victims. He intended to leave no survivors there. The costume was worn so that if someone saw him from afar, or, if a victim somehow survived, which Brian Hartnell actually did, the mythological image of the Zodiac would be cemented in the public consciousness.
He wanted the legend out there.
Exactly. And that need for recognition escalated. After that very attack, he drove 27 miles to a car wash in downtown Napa for the sole purpose of using a payphone.
To call the Napa County Sheriff's Department himself.
Right.
He reports his own double murder, tells the dispatcher exactly what he did, and then just leaves the physical phone off the hook.
Just dangling there.
Yeah. He wanted the police to find the exact receiver he had just been holding. It's an incredible level of arrogance.
But leaving a phone dangling in a booth, that wasn't a loud enough megaphone for his ego. He needed the entire state of California, really the entire country, to know his moniker. And that specific psychological hunger led him to create a completely new game.
A game that bypassed the police entirely, right?
Yes, one that involved the press and the public directly.
And that pathological need takes us straight into his massive correspondence campaign. This guy sent over 20 letters to local newspapers. He even mailed bloody swatches of the cab driver Paul Stein's shirt just to prove he was the genuine article.
Which is just so incredibly brazen.
It is, and the absolute cornerstone of this media campaign was his cryptography. He mailed 4 ciphers in total. And the contrast between how the first 2 were solved is a perfect illustration of how complex this case became.
Oh, the evolution of those ciphers tells a story all its own.
Let's break down that evolution. You have the first one, the Z408 cipher, sent in the summer of 1969 in 3 parts to 3 different papers. And it didn't take a supercomputer or the FBI to solve it.
No, not at all.
It took a few days, and it was cracked by a married couple in Salinas, Donald and Betty Hardin. They were literally high school teachers. And what's brilliant is how Betty did it. She didn't use advanced mathematics. She used human psychology.
She got inside his head.
Right. She employed a cryptography technique called a crib. She simply assumed that a killer with an ego this massive would inevitably use words like I and kill.
Naturally.
So by guessing where those words might appear based on letter frequency, she just started mapping the symbols to the alphabet.
It was a total triumph of intuitive deduction. The Hardins realized it was a homophonic substitution cipher.
Which means what exactly for the listener?
Right, so that means a single common letter, like E, might be represented by multiple different symbols to throw off code breakers. But because the killer's language was so predictable, the cipher fell apart quickly, revealing his chilling message about collecting slaves for the afterlife.
Creepy stuff.
Very. However, the killer clearly learned from that defeat. When he mailed his next major code, the Z340 cipher, a few months later, he fundamentally changed the architecture of the puzzle.
He made it so complex that it sat completely unsolved for 51 years. I mean, the Z340 wasn't cracked until December of 2020.
Over half a century later.
Yeah, by an international team of private citizens David Orenchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl Van Eyck. And human intuition like Betty Hardin's, that wasn't going to cut it this time. They had to use a custom software program called AZCrypt.
And the reason human intuition failed is because the Z340 wasn't just a substitution cipher anymore. It was also a transposition cipher.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so you couldn't just read it left to right. The killer shifted the alignment of the text, forcing you to read it diagonally in a very specific repeating pattern before you could even begin to substitute the letters.
And that's where the computational power comes in. From our sources, AZDecrypt works by running a hill-climbing algorithm.
Which sounds complicated, but it's really just trial and error on steroids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It essentially generates a random key, tests it, and measures how closely the resulting text matches standard English n-grams. And n-grams are just common groupings of letters, like THE or ING.
Right.
If a tiny tweak to the key makes the text look slightly more like English, the software keeps that change and, quote-unquote, climbs the hill toward a solution. They had to run something like 650,000 possible variations through this algorithm.
Just a staggering number.
Yeah, before it finally hit the correct diagonal reading pattern.
And after half a century of mystery, the message was finally revealed, reading in part, "I hope you're having lots of fun in trying to catch me." Complete with his signature spelling errors, of course.
Lots fan instead of fun.
Exactly. But the jump from the Z408 to the Z340, it represents a massive leap in cryptographic sophistication.
Okay, but I have to push back here. If the Zodiac's entire psychological profile is wrapped up in showing off and proving how much smarter he is than the police, why make the remaining ciphers so short?
What?
I mean, the Z13 literally begins with the phrase, "my name is," followed by 13 symbols. And the Z32 is a map cipher meant to locate a bomb. Cryptographers agree these are mathematically unsolvable. Why would a narcissist play a game if no one can ever read his winning move?
This raises an important question about the boundaries of cryptography itself.
Okay.
It all comes down to a mathematical concept called unicity distance.
Unicity distance, meaning if a ciphertext is too short, There simply isn't enough structural data to prove a single solution is the correct one. Right.
That is precisely it.
It leaves the door open for multiple valid translations.
Exactly. A cipher needs a certain volume of text to establish a definitive statistical pattern. If the message falls below that threshold, below its unicity decence, there are simply too many valid keys that produce readable but completely different English translations.
Wow.
So, because the Z13 and Z32 are so incredibly short, you could theoretically decode them into hundreds of different coherent phrases.
Leaving us with no way to verify which one the killer actually intended.
Right. And to illustrate how absurd this gets, the cryptologist Craig P. Bauer actually demonstrated that you can mathematically manipulate this short Z13 cipher to perfectly spell out Alfred E. Newman.
The fictional mascot from Mad Magazine.
Yes. The Zodiac didn't create a fair puzzle. He rigged the game. He gets the thrill of dangling his true identity in front of the world, knowing with absolute certainty that no one can ever definitively prove what those 17 symbols say.
He traps law enforcement in a game they're mathematically barred from winning. So we have his twisted ideology mapped out in his letters. We have these incredibly complex codes, but we still lack his real name.
We do.
But when you dive into the investigative files, the police definitely had a favorite target. Out of an estimated 2,500 people investigated by the San Francisco Police Department, only a tiny handful were considered truly credible.
But one man stood above the rest, serving as the focal point for law enforcement for decades, and that's Arthur Lee Allen. He remains the only man ever officially named as a primary suspect by the police.
When you look at the circumstantial evidence surrounding Allen, it's easy to see why he became the gravitational center of the investigation. I mean, he was a former elementary school teacher and a convicted sex offender. He actively spoke about hunting people.
Which is a huge red flag.
Huge. He even wore a literal Zodiac brand wristwatch, which featured the exact same crosshairs logo the killer drew on his letters and his executioner's hood.
It's almost too on the nose.
It really is. And Robert Graysmith, the cartoonist at the San Francisco Chronicle, who became heavily involved in researching the case, he wrote a massively popular book that essentially pointed the finger entirely at Allen.
And while the internet has crowdsourced a sprawling list of other amateur suspects over the decades, names you'll frequently see in forums like Gary Francis Post, Richard Gaikowski, or Lawrence Kane Allen was the absolute white whale for the actual detectives working the case.
But here's where it gets really interesting. We have all this circumstantial evidence pointing at Allen, but then modern science enters the picture. In 2002, the SFPD Crime Lab managed to develop a partial DNA profile.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
They extracted it from saliva found on the stamp of a verified 1969 Zodiac correspondence. They tested that DNA against Arthur Lee Allen's profile, and it was not a match.
On the surface, that sounds like definitive exoneration.
It sounds like case closed. But you dive into the research, and you find a massive counter-perspective that throws everything back into chaos. Zodiac researcher Tom Voigt heavily emphasizes that the DNA material was pulled from the front of the stamp.
Not the back.
Right, not the back where the sender would lick the adhesive, the front, meaning that partial DNA profile could literally belong to a mail sorting clerk in 1969, a postmaster, a careless police detective, or anyone who physically handled the front of that envelope before evidence preservation protocols were modernized.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this specific debate highlights the inherent danger of information overload and how it feeds confirmation bias.
Oh, totally.
We have a mountain of disparate clues, partial fingerprints from the cab, palm prints from the payphone, handwriting samples, DNA, eyewitness descriptions. When investigators or modern internet sleuths have a favorite suspect, they tend to force the ambiguous evidence to fit their theory rather than letting the evidence lead the way.
It becomes a self-sealing argument. If a fingerprint doesn't match their guy, the theory morphs into, well, the Zodiac obviously wore falsified fingerprints.
Right.
If the DNA doesn't match, oh, the DNA must be tainted.
Exactly. Detective Dave Toshi, one of the lead SFPD investigators on the case, expressed immense frustration over this. He eventually had to admit that despite his strong gut feeling about Arthur Lee Allen, every single piece of physical evidence they tested against him ultimately came back negative.
That has to be maddening.
The sheer volume of clues actually made it harder to secure a conviction because there was always a conflicting piece of data.
Which brings us to the most baffling aspect of this entire deep dive. If the police investigated 2,500 suspects, if they had partial fingerprints, matching boot prints, and actual eyewitness sketches, How did this guy physically manage to slip through a massive statewide dragnet?
It was a catastrophic collision of jurisdictional boundaries, primitive bureaucratic communication, and sheer maddening luck.
We have to remember the technological landscape of 1969. The killer crossed county and city lines between Vallejo, Napa, Benicia, and San Francisco. Today, an algorithm flags those connections across national databases instantly.
But back then, law enforcement relied on carbon copies mailed between departments and, informal phone calls between detectives. Information was heavily siloed.
So slow.
Right. A clue discovered in Vallejo might take weeks to fully integrate into the San Francisco Police Department's working theory. This bureaucratic friction drastically slowed down the investigative momentum.
But even with those massive structural hurdles, the SFPD had an opportunity to end the terror on the night of October 11, 1969. This is the Presidio Heights murder of the cab driver Paul Stine. And detailing the breakdown of this specific night explains exactly how he got away.
So frustrating to look back on.
It really is. The Zodiac shoots Stine in the front seat of the cab. 3 teenagers happen to look out the window of a house across the street. They are actively watching him wipe down the dashboard, and they call the police while the killer is still inside the vehicle.
The teenagers provided a very clear description to the operator. A husky, adult white male wearing a dark jacket.
But somewhere between the operator receiving that call and the radio dispatcher broadcasting it to the patrol cars, a fatal error occurred. The dispatcher mistakenly reported over the radio that the suspect was a black male.
It altered the entire trajectory of the manhunt.
2 patrol officers, Donald Fook and Eric Zomes, are responding to the scene. Just minutes after the murder, they are driving toward the intersection and they observe a white man in dark clothes walking away from the crime scene, heading north toward the Presidio Park.
Walking right past them.
Because their radio told them to look for a black suspect, a white guy walking down the sidewalk simply doesn't register on their threat matrix. They literally pull up alongside the Zodiac Killer.
Unbelievable.
They ask him if he saw anything suspicious. He casually points them east, claims a guy was waving a gun over there, and the officers speed off to chase a ghost. They let him walk right into the park and disappear.
And adding insult to injury, the Zodiac was fully aware of the police's blunder. He gloated about this exact encounter in a taunting letter to the Chronicle just weeks later, specifically mocking the officers for stopping him and letting him go.
It's agonizing to examine. It's like a frustrating movie plot hole where you want to scream at the screen. Except this actually happened. A single miscommunication on a radio dispatcher's end cost the police their only chance to catch him red-handed, with the murder weapon and the bloody pieces of Paul Stine's shirt still stuffed in his pockets.
And what's crucial to understand is that the Zodiac didn't just passively benefit from this confusion. He actively weaponized it moving forward.
How so?
Well, he realized how disjointed the law enforcement system was, and he exploited that fracture. Following the Presidio Heights escape, he sent a letter declaring he would fundamentally change his tactics again. He wrote that his future murders would, quote, look like routine robberies, killings of anger, and a few fake accidents.
So he's intentionally flooding the zone. If every robbery gone wrong or hit and run could secretly be the Zodiac, it paralyzes the police.
Precisely. By declaring that his future crimes would mimic ordinary street violence, he made it impossible for investigators to distinguish a genuine Zodiac attack from random tragedy. He effectively created a massive smokescreen over the entire state.
A needle in a stack of needles.
Exactly. The police were no longer looking for a man in an executioner's hood. They were looking at every single unsolved death in California and wondering if it was him.
So what does this all mean for us today? We started this deep dive talking about puzzles. And if there's one overarching lesson this massive archive of sources provides, it's that having an abundance of data, thousands of suspects, dozens of encrypted letters, footprints, disputed DNA, none of that equals having the truth.
No, it doesn't.
For anyone trying to understand the evolution of criminal justice, this case is the ultimate cautionary tale about the limits of human investigation before the advent of modern centralized forensics.
It demonstrates how evidence without context, or evidence that is miscommunicated across bureaucratic lines, can actively pull you further away from the solution. The noise completely drowns out the signal.
And yet, despite the noise, we collectively cannot look away. The internet continues to crowdsource this mystery today. Just look at the international team that cracked the Z340 cipher in 2020.
Right, over 50 years later.
51 years later, people are still writing custom software to decode his taunts. It speaks to our enduring, almost desperate human obsession with finding order in chaos. We fundamentally want the puzzle to make sense.
We crave a neat resolution, you know? We want the villain unmasked and the story cleanly resolved. But the reality of this case is far more unsettling than any tidy conclusion.
It truly is. Which leaves us with one final, incredibly chilling concept to mull over. Throughout his correspondence, the Zodiac claimed to have killed 37 people, though only 5 are definitively confirmed.
The huge discrepancy.
Right. And then in 1974, the letters just abruptly stopped. The grand performance ended. He vanished from the public eye. Now, the psychiatrist David Van Noy has heavily studied the psychological profile of the killer based on our sources, and he proposed a fascinating theory based on the shifting writing styles and chaotic behavior.
Yes.
He believed the killer suffered from multiple personality disorder.
And the most compelling aspect of that specific psychiatric diagnosis is that the symptoms can naturally lessen as a person ages. The violent impulses and the need for the alternate persona can slowly fade away over time.
Which forces you to ask a truly terrifying question. Did the most infamous serial killer in American history die in a car crash? Did he get locked up for an unrelated petty crime under a different name?
It's entirely possible.
Or did the Zodiac persona simply quiet down inside the mind of an ordinary man? Did he just pack up his handmade executioner's hood, throw away his felt-tip pens, and live out the rest of his life quietly, mowing his lawn and waving to neighbors who never had a single clue who was living right next door?